Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really delighted to see so many of you here today for this exciting event. I am Debbie Weinstein, the Assistant Director of the Pembroke Center at Brown, and I am moderating the discussion with Anne Fausto-Sterling and Evelynn Hammonds on the past and future of feminist science studies. And I'm going to introduce our speakers very briefly, since there are longer introductions and bios in the program. As you all know, Anne Fausto-Sterling is the Nancy Duke Lewis Professor of Biology and Gender Studies in the Department of Molecular Biology, Cell Biology, and Biochemistry at Brown, where she was also the founding director of the Science and Technology Studies program. She has published widely on scientific approaches to the study of human difference. She will be retiring at the end of June after over 40 years of serving on the Brown faculty. Evelynn Hammonds is the Barbara Gutman Rosencrantz Professor of the History of Science and Professor of African and African American Studies at Harvard, where she has also served as the Senior Vice Provost for Faculty Development and Diversity and the Dean of Harvard College. She has published widely on the history of science, medicine and public health in the US, race and gender and science studies, and feminist theory and African American history. So I'm going to pepper the conversation periodically with questions, let Anne and Evelynn talk, and then we'll open things up for discussion. So, Anne and Evelynn, we are here today to talk about the past and future of feminist science studies. I want to begin with a question about the two of you, since it is not incidental to the topic at hand. How do the two of you know each other, and how have you worked together over the course of your careers?
So you might think this is an easy question to answer, but I don't know how much email we've expended on trying to figure it out. We think a little bit around 1979.
Yeah, right. We dated it to when you were still
a
master's student at MIT.
Right. I was a graduate student at MIT in physics, and I met Anne just before I stepped out of that world. And then she invited me back into that world through, I think there were several kind of meetings of feminist scholars in Cambridge, and Anne would come up and we'd see each other, but we became friends. And then, but I think the pivotal moment definitely has to be this Mellon seminar we participated in at the Center for Research on Women at Wellesley. So you want to talk about the center?
Yeah, this was organized, this was an extraordinary moment, I think, for feminist science studies. It was organized by Peggy McIntosh, whose work I suspect a number of you are familiar with, and if not, Google her and read her, because she has these wonderful short pieces on, right now, especially on white privilege, although she's been doing those pieces and redoing them for quite a number of years. But Peggy hosted people who were trying to think about the question of gender and science. And the people who were at this seminar at one point or another were myself, Evelynn, Helen Longino, Evelyn Fox Keller, Elizabeth Potter, who else? Was Donna there at all?
Sandra Harding.
Sandra Harding. And probably a few other people we're forgetting. But essentially that seminar founded the sort of horizontal cohort of people in different fields who began to think beyond the question of how many women are there in the field of science, to think about what does it mean to talk about gender in the sciences, and not just gender in biology, but gender in other fields of science as well. And those were all ideas that we were wrestling mightily with and didn't have, I don't know that we have terrific answers today, but we have better answers today than we did when we first posed the question.
Absolutely.
All right, so to reflect then more broadly on the history of feminist science studies, this term, feminist science studies, is one that many of us in this room have used, but not all of us. And so I'm wondering if you could characterize feminist science studies and reflect for us on how it's changed over time.
I'll start and you can take it up. Okay, so when I wrote Myths of Gender, which I was writing in the early 80s, and it first came out, thank you, first came out in 85, I was very struck by the fact that extremely prestigious scientists were involved in this business of finding women inferior based on biology. And I'm talking about your Charles Darwins and all of the early founders of psychology. And I had colleagues at the time who read my book and said, well, it's just bad science. And so my question was, how come it's the top, most rewarded scientists in the world who are doing this so-called bad science? And that I felt like I had to know more about how science actually worked in a cultural context. At the time, feminist theory really wasn't much help in this area, but a budding field called science studies was beginning to analyze science as a cultural process of knowledge formation, and I thought that if I could understand more from that field, but then also ask the gender question, which they mostly weren't asking, that I could begin to understand better how gender and science intersect and how it is that knowledge about gender kept getting produced and reproduced, and by the top people in the field, not by just a few cranky people over on the side. So that was sort of how feminist science studies started, and there were other people doing this as well.
But I think we want to step back and look at a little bit at how confused that early moment was. Because every time somebody like Anne would say, no, we need to be talking about gender in science, we'd always end up talking about women in science. And Banu knows this. She wrote a wonderful sort of review article that was extremely helpful for this presentation about, and reminded me of that moment as being a moment of confusion, because we couldn't talk about gender in science without always slipping into there are not enough women in science. And so the field, if there is a field of feminist science studies, or I think there is, but at that moment there were people who were interested in really bringing more women into science at the professoriate first, but then then there's the whole other things about girls in science and those kinds of what was happening in higher ed as well as K through 12 and all those things. And so that was being talked about sometime at the very same table. We were trying to talk about gender and science too. And people often conflated the issues related to women in science with issues related to gender in science. And part of what was happening, and part of, I think, one of the great interventions that Anne's work made was to push that we have to be clear about these kinds of distinctions, both about sex and gender, but about women in science and gender and science. And then feminist studies, I think, encompasses all of it, but sometimes we forget that it has these different areas embedded within it. And there was a fair amount of crosstalk because, of course, some of the women trying to do the gender and science issues were women who were trying to get tenure and promotion and recognition in their fields and all these things. So it actually, the two sets of issues actually, were kind of pushed together in the living bodies, and there were ways in which it spilled out in the early sort of scholarship in the 1980s as well. So a lot of people wrote essays about women in science. At the same time, some of those people moved on to write about gender and science.
Good, that's useful.
Did you want to?
No, just to say that I think that that's really useful. And I think there was also kind of an inchoate hope that if we got more women, and actually I'll extend it to say more women, people of color, people who weren't the standard white male scientists, more working class people doing science, that somehow that would shift what kind of science got done. Mm-hmm. I think that was naive, but because I think it didn't grapple sufficiently with the whole question of structure, which the older I get, the more I keep saying, Paula can attest to this, it's not you, it's about the structure. And sort of that you can use that about anything that you're doing.
Right.
Well, I wonder if you could build on this then and elaborate on what you see as the central issues and challenges that informed early interest in thinking critically about the relationship among gender, race, and science. This was certainly one, but if you could elaborate on that.
So I think we had, like I said, I think we had this big question, the women in and the gender in. So but as more women came into certain fields, then you began to see shifts in focus. And people had a couple of exemplary examples. There was primatology. So as more women went into primatology, then the whole notion of primate behavior began to shift. Donna Haraway's written most beautifully about that. But then really within the substance of the science itself, those new women going into the science, and some of them have been in that science for a long time, just asked different questions about primate behavior than had been asked before. And that really was a field-changing set of interventions. That was not replicated in everything.
Right.
So I think there was a predominance of women who were focusing in on health issues. I think some things changed with the fights to get women included in clinical trials. Those kinds of issues, you began to see some transformations both in policy and research. But then I would say a challenge was then and remains now mathematically oriented sciences to some extent, which is probably not the right way to say it now, but it was the way to say it then. And also some of what we always refer to as the hard sciences, although Anne was one of the first people who said we can't say hard and soft. And then, and that we return to, but the physical sciences, chemistry, math, physics, whole domains of technical fields like engineering were incredibly resistant to any kind of feminist analysis, and in many ways, I would suggest, remain resistant. And I think what we've learned and what we were naive about is that we thought, surely if more women go into those areas as well, those that were feminists would take up this kind of project that we were already engaged in and be able to make interventions in that field, in those fields, and I'm not sure that that has really happened. It certainly hasn't happened in a way that I think is sufficient.
So, I mean, I think the question of the struggle about trying to see what the intersections and differences are between race and gender are also still going on. And I think the other piece of where Evelynn and I have interacted over a long period of time now is that Evelynn organized when she was at MIT and then at Harvard a very important ongoing workshop specifically about race and science that a number of us in the area attended, trying to struggle with some of the same issues, but they're always different because, for one thing, the biological questions are not identical, but trying to struggle also with the reinscription of race in biology time after time, and we're seeing it now in a big way. I mean, there's huge discussions. We're on a listserv together, as are some of the people in the audience, that are trying to address how race is getting used in the Genome Project now and in health and public health. So I think that maybe some of the analytical methods that we developed get applied, but the answers that work for gender aren't necessarily the same ones that work for race.
Right. Right.
Well, I'm glad that you brought up both of those issues. I'm interested, how did efforts to bring race and gender as analytic categories into science studies illuminate questions that the fields that constitute science studies did not want to address?
So, what a sad story. I really think that what we missed was a kind of serious attention to it, an intersectional approach. So that when we use the term women, we should have really been extremely attentive to the need to talk about all women and race and class being important aspects of women's lives. We had a very U.S. focus, so we also missed some international issues, I think, though there's an international feminist movement that did, so the feminist science studies movement that did kind of dovetail. But I think race it's just a different history of race in the United States that has been so dominant. And I think, prevailing paradigms of race with respect to science harken back to the moment of that was like gender, but then gender goes in a different direction, which is to say that there's some fundamental incapacity in people who are raced that doesn't allow them to do science. And that sort of was a question about women and sort of a question that would come through gender, but it's such a strong question and a strong set of assumptions that when we talk about race and science. But I think that we've tried to take up that question, and I think another parallel part of it is how we keep reproducing this problematic between sex and gender. It's the same way we keep reproducing this problematic about racial differences, and that race as a scientific object continues to carry many, many traces of practically old racial science that are very, very difficult to dislodge. Without it being seen as the only people who really care about that are the victims of this kind of work, and that other people shouldn't care about it. That in, say, my discipline, history of science, that studying race and science doesn't illuminate any major themes in history of science, so why should anybody care about it? You know, of course, in the history of science, if you can't explain what the American scientific workforce looks like and why it looks the way it looks, then you can't explain very much. And one of the ways in which that it looks is a lot of exclusion of minorities in the US. So that's something to be explained about. Even though American science can be very successful, it's successful on the basis of a set of exclusions. And that explaining that set of exclusions as productive, rather than just, you know, something to do with whether or not we should do the right thing by people of color, is a very important set of questions. And I think we've tried to grapple with them. Anne and we've never stopped talking about this. I mean, it's one of the issues that we began talking about, in part because Anne's mother had done a lot of work on African American history and her focus on women, African American women, and that was a connection for us. And I certainly took that and wanted to really make sure that we were dealing with that in science, in feminist science studies. It's just been harder, I think, in many ways.
Yeah, I would also say that I mean, like any field, science studies was a new aggregate field which drew from several standard disciplines, sociology of science, philosophy of science, the political science to some degree, anthropology. But then, like any of these individual fields, as it came together, the people who had the bigger power, the bigger structures were men, and mostly they weren't feminist. And so there were all of the feminists who were screaming at them, saying, "You can't write all this stuff and just ignore our work," because it was this strong body of work from that same group that Peggy McIntosh coalesced. Mm-hmm. And so I think one moment at the 4S, the meeting, this is the Social Studies of Science meeting years ago, was Donna Haraway just taking Bruno Latour apart at a symposium on his book for every female that he left out, and he was actually somewhat chastened after that, but I wouldn't say that he became perfect. So you had the same set of issues, in a way, iterated within this field that at the same time was a field that gave people like me and Evelynn tremendous tools to do the work that we wanted to do, and yet at the same time an awful lot of it just didn't have either gender or race in it. I think that's changing some. I know that there are tending to be somewhat more articles now in the official journal, the Social Studies of Science, and in some other journals that are beginning to address some of these questions. But it's about the structure. Unless you start addressing the structure of academia as a whole, then you don't. The structure really, I think, helps form the content.
Well, the way we've been talking about science studies, in the way I want to turn and ask the science question. Mm-hmm. So how was early feminist scholarship around gender and science different from early feminist scholarship on other fields, say, such as literature or history?
Yeah, you gave us that question, and it was a hard one for me to think about, because it seemed to me, when I was a graduate student, I used to attend the Berkshire Conference on Women's Historians. Susan was there, among other folks in the room. And it seemed to me that women's history was sort of coalescing in a very strong way. I mean, the Berkshires still was a meeting that was primarily for and about women, but people were taking that work out of the Berks into the AHA, the larger professional meetings, the OAH, and in our fields, History of Medicine Society, History of Science Society. People were taking that work out, but it was less in History of Medicine and in History of Science Society than it was in the larger meetings. And so I think women's history is getting a toehold, and then of course, you know, Joan Scott's big intervention to switch to gender in history was something, and there seemed to be a lot of people who were able to take advantage of that door opening. And I think we're talking about a much smaller, I don't want to call feminist science studies, I really don't know if I want to call it a field, but maybe the best word is a network or something like that, because we cross so many disciplinary boundaries. And that I think we didn't have that sort of a shared methodology, a shared organization, a consensus about particular methodologies, or even, I would say, even a prominent public face. So I think that in literature and history, feminist studies were able to make interventions, and I think the most important one being able to have a lot more students and begin a second generation of work sooner than we were able to do. Though I just want to thank all the people in this room who we see as our students, and who are now professors and getting tenure and doing wonderful things. It's great for them to be here. So.
Including Debbie, I might add.
Yeah, right.
I was students of both of these people.
Yeah.
So Debbie was an undergrad at Brown and worked with me, and a grad student at Harvard, and you know, interacted with Evelynn. So let me add to that, by the way, two other names at the Wellesley nexus that we forgot are Ruth Hubbard and Ruth Bleier.
That's right, that's right. That's right.
And I have to say that Ruth Hubbard is someone I went to when I was beginning to think about writing something about gender and science, and she had already published several things, and I was like, I was very timid, and I went up to visit her, and I said, well, you know, basically I didn't want her to get mad at me for stepping on her toes, for moving into her field, and she was just extraordinarily encouraging and said, you know, we need more and more people writing whatever book it is you think you're going to write. You're not going to, you know, steal my thunder. So there was a tremendous amount of support from women who were, I don't know, what is she, a decade and a half older than me, something like that. And Ruth Bleier too, well, she passed away at way too young an age, but she was also very encouraging. But I want to say, I think there's another problem that makes science different from literature or history, and that is what I've came to call the ideology of science, the idea that science is something objective, that science, as Sharon Trawick wrote, is a culture of no culture, that science is something where the gender question doesn't even make sense to many, even today, to many working scientists, and it certainly didn't when we first posed it. The women in science question made some sense. Yeah, you could get more women in. But what it would mean to talk about gender in science didn't make sense to people, although it did make sense to people if you were talking about Jane Eyre, or if you were talking about some important female historical figure, or in fact talking about, you know, what women were doing in any particular historical era. So I think that the interventions, particularly that philosophers like Sandra Harding did, to begin to attack and analyze the whole notion of objectivity and what it is and what it means and how it works and how it's a socially constructed idea too, later joined by some of the historians, oh God, I'm going to block her name at the Max Planck now. Your old friend, yes, Rainey Daston, and her work on objectivity, the historical work, I think was a foundation that needed to be built in order to even begin to ask the gender question about science, and you didn't have to do quite so much of that really hard, essentially philosophical work on what knowledge production is in some of the other fields, I think, as you did for science.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely right. And I think the other part for those of us, so Anne's trained as a biologist, I'm trained as a physicist and electrical engineer. And while I knew then in my toes, and I know now in my toes, that it is a gendered enterprise in physics and engineering and chemistry in those places. It has just been really difficult to tease out how it played out in the everyday practices and the production of knowledge. And so, because the end result is stripped so much of all the messy stuff that goes into it. And back to Sharon Trawick's notion that her ethnographic study of high energy physicists who said, you know, she described them as having a culture of no culture. But the thing that I experienced was how hard they worked to make a culture of no culture, and then make that culture of no culture productive for what they were trying to do. And so there's something in there that we still haven't touched, but that to me was the way in, and it's still something that I think we have to try harder to try to show, because as I said, I know that it is, because you wouldn't need to silence other voices of difference so systematically, relentlessly, and persistently if there wasn't a problem with letting those other voices in. So there's something in these productive silences and the production of a culture of no culture in the physical sciences that we as feminist scholars just haven't been able to penetrate. And I also think that because of there's also been a difference in the numbers of women, so that women in those fields still have, I think, significant barriers to being accepted for doing the acceptable work. There's not a lot of room to do that which is not the acceptable work.
So that's a good transition to my next question, which is what do you see as the big questions and pressing challenges for thinking critically about race and gender moving forward?
You can have that one first.
I have a feeling it's going to be the same. Well, let me say there's the negative challenge and the possible challenge. I think in a way we've heard the negative challenge from a couple of the talks this morning, and that is the iteration, the reiteration of the same problem in new dress over and over again. So now it's sex in the human genome. Now it's sex in fMRIs. Now it's this. Now it's that. You always keep. It's a kind of recursive going back to trying to find sex somewhere, and it moves around depending on what the current important science is. So and that combined with, and I also love that Beck put in the public, what did you call it? The popularization. Yeah, because you see this, and I also was remarking on that story, the Nicholas Wade story from, where is she? From
Sarah.
Here. Oh, she's over here. Nicholas Wade story from last week, because I went, if every time that crosses my desk in some way, I immediately go and read the original article, and I'm like, wait, there isn't any sex difference in here. How did that happen? So a continuing problem is how to intervene in the popularization. So that's one level of how do you intervene in that recursive reproduction of difference. And I think you have to, there are two ways to do that. One is to start working more in the popular field, that is writing your own articles, popular articles, newspaper articles, talking to reporters, writing blogs, and I think there's a fair amount of that going on. And so that's part of it. But the other thing I think is that, and it's my own personal pet project, which is that there's a reason why this language still is so impossible to get rid of, and that's because it's very powerful. The either or, simple, it's this or it's that way of thinking about the world is a very easy thing for people to grasp onto, and they don't have another language to think about it. So my own personal project on trying to develop dynamic systems as a language that eventually, and finding a way to express it in a way that isn't so abstruse that people roll their eyes when they hear it, is is the other important thing, is that we have to find different language that is also powerful and that help people, including reporters and also people who read newspapers and blogs, to think about human development and human psychology in a different, more complex way. So we also, I think one of our jobs has to be to give a new language out to people and not just only counter the old language.
Yeah, I do think this business of what we've tried to do in the academy and the popular, the need for a certain sets of public education projects is a very important one. I think Peggy Pasco talked a long time ago about on the issue of race, how we got more and more sophisticated in talking about race in the academy, and then there's a big gap between how people still talk about it on the street. And so we can have all these nuances and you know, that we feel comfortable with at this point, but that has got to translate somehow into helping to help regular folks understand what we are trying to say about the meaning of race and the ways in which it's still used in this country to emphasize fundamental differences between human groups and rank them and ascribe certain characteristics to one group and other characteristics to another group, and those are always done in the traditional way. You know, the white folks are doing something really good and the black folks are doing something really bad. Whether it's culture or biology or now genes, it doesn't really matter. It's that same sort of narrative, and we have to find a way to make that narrative both more complicated and more straightforward at the same time. And that is a real challenge because, again, if we talk about younger scholars, that's not necessarily something to get you tenure, but I think for all of us, we have to figure out ways to do that, and I think that's something that we're trying to move toward now as a way to get that across. So, I think there's a deeper fundamental question in that we haven't talked about. I think one of the things that that I learned from Anne and that I so much admire about her is a deep commitment to science, that science actually matters, that the evidence matters, that how we do it and the questions we ask actually matter. And I don't think that that's necessarily something that's widely shared out in the public. It's still, you know, those are still the people who are, even on something as popular as the Big Bang Theory, and it's very popular, but they self-consciously model themselves as different from other people. And they constantly throughout the show make a joke of putting down people who can't speak the inside code of that they speak. And I think that still puts that wall between those who will do science and understand it and those who are just gonna listen to the bad jokes. So it's commensurate upon us, those of us who have a commitment to this way of knowing, these ways of knowing the world and the production of knowledge about us, objects, and our natural world and society, to take that very, very seriously. And that commitment is one I think we can't give up on, and we can't let other people give up on.
So before I open up things for general questions, Evelynn, I have a question particularly for you. Okay. One could describe the trajectory of Anne's work as moving from an analysis of bad science and myths of gender, that is, an analysis of research that was poorly done about the biological basis of sex differences and sexuality, to a broader critique of the production of scientific knowledge about binary human difference and sexing the body, to developing a research program about the development of gender differences grounded in developmental systems theory in order to move beyond the nature-nurture divide and study the embodied relationship between the social and the biological. Anne has also collaborated and published, Evelynn with you and others, on critical studies of the category of race and its status in science and medicine. And Evelynn, I'm wondering if you could reflect for us on what you see as the significance and impact of Anne's work, as well as maybe some of the challenges it has faced.
I'm watching you.
She's watching me. There's nothing to worry about.
Right.
So, as I said, as I was just saying at the end of that last little speech, I think Anne is an exemplary scholar, and all of you all here are testimony to that, as well as an extraordinary teacher, as well as, I think, like I was saying at the end, when I said in the last comment, what I said about a commitment to science, that to me is something, one of the singular signal, I should say, points that I have experienced from you. Anne doesn't let you walk away from this. You've got to get in it. You've got to get in it, tear it apart, try to understand, see where the things have come, how these different pieces come together, show where it's working and it's thoughtful, and show where it's not working and it's not thoughtful, but at the end of the day, say why it matters. And say what it means, and say it clearly and forcefully and unapologetically. And there aren't a lot of people who put all of that together and really stay committed to the science itself, to her community of scientists, to her community of activists, to her community of feminist scholars, and to making public and popular, making her work accessible to the publics of various kinds, and also be an extraordinary teacher and mentor. There just aren't a lot of people who do that, and do it as well as you do that, and leave, and you know, you're stepping down and becoming emerita. I don't know if that's going to mean anything about her life. I really don't know, but except maybe grading papers, because she's still going to be asking questions, and she's still going to be pushing us to think harder, and she's still going to tell us that science matters in the world, and we need to understand that our beliefs about, and I believe this is a key point that you've argued, our beliefs, not science, define these critical issues that we talk about, we've been talking about today. And then our beliefs help shape the kind of questions that go back in to the world of science and are answered in sometimes problematic ways. So I just want to say thank you to Debbie for giving me an opportunity to say, I can't say we're going to miss you or any of those things. I don't think she's going anywhere. But that she has left us and given us an extraordinary paradigm for doing our work, which makes her, in my view, the leading scholar in feminist studies today. And I think the work we saw today, you could see Anne's influences all over the wonderful papers we heard today. And that's not an accident. That's to do with her hard work and the positions she's taken over the years and the way she's pushed us to think harder. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now I'm really going to get embarrassed.
Oh, I'm glad I did it.
I go applaud all of you. So now I have some time for questions. Go ahead.
I need some water.
So I hope I'm going to be able to figure out how to ask this question. So I'm a physician by training. So, and you know, one of the things we never really talk about, of course, is the production of knowledge. So there isn't a real critique about the science that we are trained in. And you know, there is a big movement from social medicine to biomedicine. And that dominance of biomedicine, which I really think feeds into this culture of cultures. But I think that also what I've been trying to grapple with is, as you talk about biomedicine and you try to say that it's science and that it's unbiased and that it's free of all, you know, these other social questions, so it's somehow, you know, pristine, that what it really is about really removing the politics and the power that is really generated in these discussions. And so I just want to know how do we start to talk about that movement, the hegemony of making the biomedicine the be-all, that end all. And then in addition, there's the questions of privileging one type of science over the other. So, you know, there's the whole idea of quantification versus qualitative science, and so which really tells you more, which then doesn't talk about the bias of how the question is asked or not asked. And so then lastly, so that the last question would have to do with when we talk about the language and the ability to not be able to grasp it, I would say that so as a physician and a clinician, that it's about the practice. So we don't have the practice of talking about this. And so it always seems like it's so difficult, but it's just because people aren't practiced, so they don't have the language because they're not practiced in it. So I wouldn't say that it's that they gravitate something to more easily, so it goes into that mind, you know, nurture, nature, and how those dialogues are formed and reaffirmed without having some place to find some other language to just find it. Is that enough questions? Thanks.
Yeah, well, I think it's important to say that every field has its own challenges, and I think it's really appropriate that for medicine that you bring up the challenge of practice, because you face it not only from your colleagues and your students, but also from your patients. So I heard a psychiatrist give a talk at a conference I was just at about being called in on he gave 3 case studies of families with intersex children. And he talked about the challenges in each case of trying to give what has become the sort of standard feminist analysis that came off of some of my work on intersex about do you do surgery or not, and how you might communicate that to, say, the mother of one of the children. This is a psychiatrist working in Los Angeles. Yes, Tony, you know who it is. Whose mother is Chinese and speaks a South Chinese dialect that no one else in Los Angeles spoke, so they couldn't find a way to communicate with her very effectively, and who also had an unfathomable belief system about gender and children, and unfathomable partly because the language difficulty was so hard, and the child himself had other developmental issues and was mute. So, you know, and this psychiatrist went through that case study and then some other case studies where the linguistic challenges weren't as great, but there were other challenges. So I think when you're really talking about practice, it's not just the belief system physicians and medical knowledge walk in with, but also the belief systems of the patients. And so I think it's tremendously difficult. But there is also a whole literature within medicine written by physicians who have faced these challenges and have smart and empathic things to say about them. So I think one of the things is that each of you who is in a different field has a somewhat different set of challenges and has to take whatever any of us are saying and kind of frame it for your own specific circumstances. I don't know if that's helpful or not, but.
The thing I would add is, you know, I agree with what Anne just said about sort of the different disciplines and areas of study. But I think for the practice of medicine, something that I think is very key, there's been a strong movement for cultural competency issues, which involve programs that support medical students learning about women's issues and to some extent, and more about race and ethnicity, things like that. And one group of folks right now are beginning to question that whole paradigm and say, it's time to talk about structural competency. Yeah. And that gets to the one part of your questions to say, not that you want to have the medical student understand, not that you wouldn't want a medical student to understand that this person may be of a particular ethnicity and one might approach them somewhat differently, but at the same time, not put those differences into some kind of stereotypical boxes, rather than look specifically at the structures that have made this patient in this particular situation, whether it's the disease burden they have or their inability or their capacity to deal with certain treatment paradigms and things like that that are structural, not personal or cultural. And so it seems to me that if that takes off, then that'll be a place where, within your realm, practice could be changed because the practitioners will be more aware of the ways in which they intersect with structures in our society that affect people rather than, quote, the way we've characterized cultures.
I'm sorry, I misunderstood. When I say practice, I mean practice in not medical practice. So if that gets conflated.
Yeah, okay.
Practice in how we exercise thought at some level.
Well, I still think my points hold because I think it
great,
affects
thanks.
that too. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi. So I loved hearing your thoughts, and since I was a freshman taking Professor Fausto-Sterling's class, one of 3 that I took with you, I've been trying to think about these issues in the context in which we practice science and medicine. And even now, as a fertility specialist, I still give that example of how sort of the gender presumptions of science really delayed our understanding of the oocyte's contribution to fertilization. And so I still give that example frequently. But on the flip side, in other parts of my life, I feel like we live in a very profoundly anti-scientific country. And so in many ways, I applaud when I see, for example, I think the best example I can give, contemporary example, is on the show Cosmos. I don't know if you guys watch that, but Neil deGrasse Tyson, I mean, I haven't read anything about him saying this, but when I watch that show, I feel like there is an agenda to sort of present science as this very objective sort of thing, in a way to present science to a mass public in a way that portrays it in a very objective, grounded, hard science, as troublesome as that word is, way. And so I'm wondering, I think we would all agree that explaining what science is about to the general public is a really important goal, and engaging more people to enter the scientific fields is a really important goal. And so I'm wondering how you feel when you see those sort of efforts to sort of simplify and sort of ignore the context, and if you have any suggestions for a more nuanced way of presenting contextualized science to a general population.
Well, that's a tough one. I mean, I think when I try to talk about science to people, when I'm just, whatever kind of conversation we're really, what is this thing called science? What I try to do is talk about it as a form of knowledge that requires certain kinds of evidence, but I also try to point out that it's not fundamentally different from many other forms of knowledge that also require evidence. So if someone says to me, oh, so it's not like literature, you don't need evidence, you can think anything you want about Shakespeare, and I'm like, actually no, because if you're really doing a good literary analysis, you're going to start with the text, and that is a form of evidence. One of the things I do think that the kind of work that Neil deGrasse Tyson does is very important, because we do live in a country that right now, I mean, we're in kind of an anti-science crisis, and I think it's really problematic, because I still want engineers to build bridges that won't fall down when I drive my car over them, and they need numbers and information about material strength and things to do that. But I do think you can not just talk about science as the objective truth, but talk about it as a form of gathering knowledge. And you can do it with lots of known examples, things that are in the news. I mean, when all of the hullabaloo about seat belts being designed for people who weigh 170 pounds and are 5'10" came out because babies and women were small, short women or short people were getting strangled to death by them. Or maybe it was airbags. It was airbags. Yeah. So that's a wonderful moment to talk about how, when you're thinking through an engineering problem, you think through also the diversity of people to whom your answer is going to be applied. And I think that I haven't watched Cosmos, so I don't know what he's doing with that. I've seen him, of course, he's a big public personality, and I've seen him be pretty, I've seen him be complex, I think, in his descriptions of things. So I think you can be on the side of what your main job is to champion science and explain it to the world, but you can also pull complexity into that discussion without making people walk away and say, well, why should I believe in science? It's just crap, you know. But.
I want to take a question over there.
Thanks. I guess this is sort of a follow-up question, I guess, and it's more about, I guess, about scientific method and this theme of like taking science seriously. But I was thinking about Professor Rebecca, sorry for your last name, that slide with a sort of like that fantastic flow chart where then the complexity kind of adds to it. And I was, you know, thinking about that image, and I was wondering, you know, if that was going to be your vision of a new scientific paradigm, would you do that kind of science where you take into account like gender ideas and popularization and you know, stereotype threat, using the current methods we have of like questionnaires and measurement, or would taking seriously that approach to incorporating gender and other things require like some deeper revision to like the scientific, like the methods we use to test these things or to measure these things?
Do you want to try that? You want me to?
Good. You try first. I think I have something to say.
I think that it requires both some, it can be done both with some small methodological changes. For one thing, it obviously requires multi-level collaborations. So just methodologically, you have to have people who run the machines that measure things going on in the brain, working with people who are knowledgeable about popularization and gender theory and all of that. So you have to have interdisciplinary and multi-level by which, you know, from the cell to the world, those different levels in between, collaborations. But beyond that, I think, and this is again an idea that I've been pushing hard, which is you have to be thinking developmentally, and that really is a different way of thinking. So you can't just do a study that's a cross-sectional study of the brains of men and women at age 28 and say, oh, sex difference. That's because in a way that's just not an interesting finding from my point of view as a developmentalist. If there is a sex difference at age 28, that's just the opening question to how did that difference arise? What does it consist of? What does it mean? But mostly, where did it come from? When didn't it exist? Did it exist at age 5? Did it exist at age 10? If it only showed up at age 16, what were the things that led up to its first appearance? And those involve, so doing longitudinal or developmental studies is a very different way of doing the study. And it's very easy to do a big, quick cross-sectional study, get a huge sample size, and get a publication out of it. Doing a developmental study, a longitudinal study, particularly if humans are your subject with a long life cycle, it means more work, more time, and probably a smaller sample size, which means you have to develop different statistical methods and approaches. So I do actually think it involves rethinking how we do certain kinds of science at a fairly profound methodological level.
And I would go back, just to connect that to the question about Cosmos. I've only watched one episode, but my answer would be similar to to what Anne just said about thinking developmentally. I would rather see more in that program that's historical. He presents the facts, you know, this is the cosmos. How do we come to think about it that way? What different paths led to this beautiful picture? I mean, the graphics in this thing are extraordinary. Picture that we now have, to open it up, to show it as a human endeavor that went down certain roads, that hit certain barriers, that jumped this way and moved that way, to now we have this kind to open it up as a endeavor, a human endeavor to understand the physical world we live in, that involved humans moving, doing, gathering the evidence that leads to the final or the penultimate picture, and show that work, the making the making. And that's what I in the one episode I saw, maybe they do more of that, that it wasn't there. And that to me is the interesting part. The interesting part. So you think developmentally about when it comes to the using humans as your object, but I think that historical view of that opens up that back to the basics in, you know, History of Science 101. You know, go back to the 17th century and the scientific revolution. Look at that world. That world's a very different world than the world we lived in. And how do they come up with these questions that end up with us understanding the world this way now? Seems to me a way to help people enter, because they can see it as a human practice that involved answering questions, using new and different tools, conflicts, contentions. But at the end of the day, we now have something that we believe pretty much in the process that by which we got to this answer of what this world looks like. That's what I think would be interesting to see.
Where's the person? Yeah. No.
Was it?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, and then behind her.
Me? I want to ask a question that has to do with your question. I'm not sure I understood your question exactly, but what I heard was that something called biomedicine is eclipsing a social medicine paradigm. Now, it's certainly true that the public view of science is not so great, but science is certainly very much a part of the dominant economic model that we live with. And it's in the service of the dominant economic model that we have something called biomedicine eclipsing social medicine, right? Okay. So I guess the question is, what can you all and we all do in that enormous realm of trying to make a difference? Here's where I become pessimistic.
Oi. I mean, I guess I think at some level it's just we're always fighting. It gets back down to doing basic politics. So, well, I'm having a hard time answering it partly because I guess I don't know enough about, I haven't thought through enough on that particular area to think about it, but I mean, I'm thinking about, you know, what are the ways in which, for example, our current changes in how health care is paid for, how is that going to change the whole field of biomedicine? Are there particular interventions as voters, as activists, that we should be thinking about to push for in ways that, I mean, in ways that then allow health insurance programs to allow certain kinds of medicine to occur? I mean, again, back to this talk I heard last week in Chicago, I mean, part of the problem with how you intersect with a family in crisis over a child with some kind of birth problems is partly about how many sessions, I mean, for the psychotherapist, I mean, how many sessions are paid for? By whom? I mean, so, so the whole structure of, the whole economic structure of medicine is something that there are people who know a lot about it and where the important intervention points are. I don't know enough, but I think that it's got to be old-fashioned politics to some extent, you know, in the street, at the voting booth, all those things.
I want to take a question over there.
Well, I just wanted to say that coming here to Brown and being a colleague of Anne's, one of the points with Anne that proved to me that she came from somewhere was that we both had belonged to the same radical eating club in Madison called the Green Lantern. Right. Her radical politics took her there just as mine did, so I knew she had good origins.
Thanks, Tom.
But I wanted to comment that I was very much struck by various speakers, and you also, Anne, talking about this problem of duality and the way in which we like to divide up the world. And to suggest that there is a body of thinking, that is, the Buddhists are ones that anytime you read about Buddhist thinking, they talk about how good creates bad, and how in a dualism, one is creating the other, and thus when they're working on developing or maturing in a line of thinking, that one can move beyond dualism to non-dualism, and that this whole tradition of Buddhism could give us some clues as to how to move beyond some of the dualistic thinking that so pervades here in science or in culture.
I don't know enough about Buddhism, but I appreciate your comment, and I appreciate your bringing up the Green Lantern, which was an important place in Madison in the 1960s. So,
why don't we take a question in the front? Yeah.
I'm struck by the talk about how anti-science the culture has become, but I think there's a very related worry in that it's a very anti-intellectual society and a very anti-elitist, and that university professors, whether they're scientists or not, are portrayed as lazy layabouts. This may be particularly bad in Texas, where I am now. And well, I mean, you just have to look at our governor. God! Or the one before that. So it's really very bad. But one of the things that concerns me is that solving this is something that really takes us has to take us quite deeply. I saw recently really what was a kind of biased, sexist rant against a woman in the humanities. And one of the things that, of course, we always do in our understanding of other people is we have to fill in gaps. And I don't think the people who were doing the rant had the self-knowledge or were the kind of people. I mean, we have to fill in gaps, and we draw on ourselves. And I don't think they could draw on themselves to understand her. That is, something has really been debasing our something like psychology, our values, I mean, obviously. And that part of the reason why college professors are seen as lazy layabouts is there are not many people who can understand what it's like to be motivated to try to acquire knowledge and truth and spend hours and hours doing it, whether it's science or something else. And I don't know quite how to approach that question. I mean, it may be the same thing. We have to take more control of the public discourse.
I wish I had a good answer to that. I think you're right. That is a problem, and I think more generally, I think maybe what a number of people are speaking to is that we're in a very difficult national moment right now, and I think many of us are kind of stunned about how to deal with it, because we've seen a recurrence or an entry into public discourse of a level of racism, a level of sexism. If I thought that birth control would be on the table now, when it's not been an issue in a way since the 1950s, when it was just seen as, thank God we have some finally. So I think a lot of us are just at a moment kind of stunned about how to respond, and I think that I think responses will eventually develop, but I don't have like some glib response for you right now, especially in Texas. You have my sympathies.
Why don't we take one last question? Yeah, go ahead.
I don't want to be a last question.
We're running short on time. I'm giving you that privilege. Go ahead.
This is a poor choice because my question is totally orthogonal to everything that's been talked about here. I'm a basic scientist. I usually don't come to conferences like this. I'm here because of Anne, a colleague of 40 years. We're on the same floor, et cetera. But I feel like I'm at a basic science conference. And and it's appealing and I enjoy it. But it seems to me that, like my work, which is not relevant to anything, a lot of this isn't relevant to anything, because why don't politicians willingly step down from power? Why don't taxpayers willingly pay more money? Why don't fanatic sports fans willingly acknowledge the good points of their opponents? What is going to convince white men? Where are they going to see it in their interest to change things? All of this intellectualization isn't going to change that opinion, I don't think. They'll just find new reasons.
So I'm not that pessimistic. Because, and I tell you why, because I do think that the kinds of comments that are coming up, and certainly Anne's response is, it just actually says there's a greater need for public intellectuals to be, for those of us in the academy, whether if people think we're lazy layabouts, but that we do earn our keep, and to be more aggressively taking up a public space to talk about these issues in different ways. I mean, I think we are in, listen, I teach in one of the most elite institutions in the world, but I still think there's a responsibility to walk outside those gates and talk to other folks and really help other folks figure out how they can speak back to the politicians. I feel it's a responsibility, and a lot of our colleagues feel like it's a responsibility. Not enough of our colleagues feel like it's a responsibility, but I do think that that shift, if that happens more, then we will have, we can shift some of this public discourse. And on the other hand, I would say that the introduction of feminist studies into the academy, and I think there's going to be a discussion about this at Brown next year, but anyway, has changed the academy, and then as a result of that, in the world in better ways. I think you said in your comments about your own trajectory here at Brown, when you started out, there was no personnel, like HR. Right. Okay, I mean, everything was sort of done in a clubby kind of way. Mm-hmm. Well, the academy is less of a club than it used to be, and thank God for that. And I think there are things that have opened up. Now, they can go away. They can go away, and that's the downside. But I do think that we've made some progress, and that we need to be more assertive about the fact that these interventions that we've made are important and significant, and keep pushing our students to make them too. And I think sometimes feminist studies has been, kind of been battled. People have been in women's studies programs, or they've been singularities in other kinds of fields and things like that, and not had the power in institutions or the support from our other sister fellow disciplines to do our work. But we have made some changes. I think we ought to stand on those and push forward for more power for ourselves and more power for the work we do as forces of change in this increasingly anxious and complicated place.
Can I play on your team?
Good. Evelynn, thank you for that, because I think it's really great to hear it, and I totally think you're right. So my parents my father would look out the window in the morning and say, oh, it's cloudy, it's going to rain. And my mother would look out the window and say, oh, it's cloudy, it's going to clear. And so I was taking my father's voice for a minute there, but now let me take my mother's voice and say that one of the reasons we are in such a difficult time is that there has been so much change, and that so people are pushing back against it, people are upset by it, and I think that the idea that change is just a simple straight line or a curve or whatever that goes on and on forever it's like that warming, the curve for the climate change. It's going up and down and up and down and up and down. And we are definitely in a pushback time, but it's something is being pushed back against. And so while we have lost ground in some areas, we haven't gone back to birth control being illegal, which it was when I was at the Green Lantern. If you weren't married, you couldn't get birth control legally. You could get it, but not legally. So I do think it's important to remember when we're discouraged by all the sort of the attitudes that we find really upsetting, that they are a response to something.
So I know there were several of you who had hands up. We are up against time. I would just say we have a reception to follow. I'm delighted there's so much more that people want to say. Please stay for the reception and engage our speakers in conversation, engage one another. I just have a couple of quick additional announcements. There is a guest book up at the front. I hope you will all sign in, leave a little note for Anne. I hope you will all check out the exhibit against the back walls, things that the Pembroke Center's archivist, Wendy Corwin, has put together. I want to extend a couple of thanks. I know that Tara Nubadal extended thanks to many people at the beginning of the symposium. I want to echo all of those thanks. There are really many people without whom today would not have been possible, either because of the effort they put in or the funding that they gave. I want to extend thanks to our speakers. Thank you so much for coming. You were fabulous. And I want to express gratitude to Tara Nubadal, who, although she gave lots of other people credit, was really the person with the vision for today. So yes, Tara was really the person with the vision for today and really the force who made everything come together. And finally, I am sitting up here with my Pembroke Center hat on, but I want to take that off for a moment and put on the former student hat, which is, like many of you in this room, been a student of Anne's. And I just want to say to Anne, thank you for inspiring us, challenging us, at times making things difficult and pushing hard and pushing back on all the things that we want to see changed. And so for all of that and much, much more, thank you, Anne.